At 6:47 a.m. on March 14, 1944, Sergeant Tommy Reeves lay motionless in a shell crater 200 yards from German lines near Anzio, Italy. 5 enemy spotters had him triangulated. 3 MG-42 machine gun nests waited for movement. In the next 4 hours, he would eliminate every spotter without firing a single shot, using a technique his own officers had explicitly forbidden him to use just 2 days earlier. Tommy Reeves grew up in the coal towns of eastern Kentucky, in a place called Harlan County, where the mountains pressed close and the work ran deep. His father worked the mines. His uncle worked the mines. By 14, Tommy was underground too, running messages between shaft crews in darkness, so complete you could forget the sun existed. He learned to navigate by sound. The drip of water meant limestone. The creak of timber meant pressure. The scrape of boots told him which crew was where. He never carried a lamp like the other runners. Said it ruined his night vision. The older miners thought he was showing off until the day a tunnel collapsed, and Tommy guided 6 men out through a maze of side passages in pitch darkness. He'd memorized every turn, every junction, every ventilation shaft. Not by sight, by sound and feel, and the smell of different rock faces. When war came in 1942, Tommy enlisted the day after his 18th birthday. The recruiting officer in Lexington looked at his file and sent him to infantry. By November, he was at Fort Benning learning to kill people instead of avoiding cave-ins. His instructors noticed something unusual during night training exercises. While other recruits stumbled through darkness with flashlights, Tommy moved like he could see. He couldn't. He just knew how to listen. They made him a scout. By January 1944, Tommy was in Italy with the 3rd Infantry Division, part of the Anzio beachhead that was supposed to break the German defensive line. It didn't. Instead, 36,000 Allied troops found themselves pinned on a coastal strip 6 miles deep, surrounded by German artillery positions in the Alban Hills. Every movement drew fire. Every position was pre-sighted. Men died fetching water. The problem was German spotters. They worked in pairs, sometimes trios, positioned in ruins and tree lines with radio equipment and binoculars. When they saw Allied troop movement, they called in artillery coordinates. The shells arrived 90 seconds later. A company would move up to assault a position, and before they covered 50 yards, German 88s would bracket them with precision that seemed impossible. On February 8th, Tommy watched a platoon from Baker Company get caught in the open during a probe toward Cisterna. The spotters called it in from a bombed-out farmhouse 400 yards north. 42 men went down before they could reach cover. Tommy knew 3 of them from the same transport ship crossing the Atlantic. Private James Dougherty from Tennessee. Corporal Vincent Palmieri from New Jersey. Sergeant First, Class Robert Hutchins from Oregon, who'd promised Tommy he'd teach him to fly fish after the war. Tommy requested permission to hunt the spotters. His lieutenant, a West Point graduate named Ambrose from Connecticut, denied it. "We need you for reconnaissance, not revenge missions." On February 16th, a sniper team tried to eliminate a spotter nest in the ruins of a church tower near Campoleone. The lead sniper, a quiet kid from Minnesota named Anderson, got into position at dawn and took the shot. Hit the spotter center mass. The man collapsed. Anderson smiled. Then the second spotter, hidden in the bell tower's shadow, radioed coordinates, and Anderson's position was obliterated by a mortar barrage that arrived 30 seconds later. They found pieces of him scattered across 40 feet. Tommy requested permission again. Ambrose denied it again. Doctrine is clear. Sniper teams handle spotters. We don't send scouts on elimination missions. On March 3rd, an entire squad got pinned down trying to clear a German observation post on a hillock designated Hill 73. The spotters, positioned in a network of 3 connected positions, called in artillery that killed 7 men in 4 minutes. The squad leader, Staff Sergeant Leonard Hayes from Alabama, was the last to die. Tommy had shared a foxhole with Hayes 3 weeks earlier during a particularly bad shelling. Hayes had talked about his wife, about their farm, about how he was going to plant apple trees when he got home. Hayes died calling for a medic who couldn't reach him. That night, Tommy sat in his tent and stared at a map of the German positions. The spotters weren't just killing men. They were killing any chance of breaking out of Anzio. As long as they could call in accurate fire, every Allied advance would end in slaughter. The snipers couldn't get them. Artillery couldn't suppress them because they relocated constantly. Airstrikes were too imprecise. Someone needed to get close. Tommy had been working on something. Not officially, not with permission. Just a technique he'd been developing during night patrols, based on how he'd navigated mine shafts as a kid. He called it shadow linking. The idea was simple but insane. Instead of hiding from the enemy, you moved in their blind spots by tracking their attention patterns. You became part of their environment, a shadow that existed at the edge of their awareness, but never quite resolved into a target. It required memorizing where spotters looked and when, how often they swept sectors, when they adjusted binoculars, when they reached for radio equipment. You had to map their pattern the way Tommy used to map tunnel sounds, then move in the gaps between their observations. Not when they weren't looking. That was impossible to predict. But when their attention was committed elsewhere, focused so completely on one sector that their peripheral awareness collapsed. He'd tested it on 4 patrols. Each time, he'd gotten within 100 yards of German, positions that were supposed to be impenetrable. Once he'd been so close to a machine gun nest that he could hear the gunner complaining about the cold. He'd marked their positions, reported back, and watched as artillery plastered the coordinates he'd provided. On his last patrol, Tommy had gotten within 30 feet of a German spotter team before returning undetected. He wrote up a report explaining the technique, handed it to Lieutenant Ambrose. The lieutenant read it twice, then called Tommy into his tent. "This is insane," Ambrose said. "You're describing stalking techniques, not reconnaissance. It works. It violates every principle of scouting doctrine. You're supposed to observe and report, not infiltrate enemy positions. The positions I observed last week are the ones we destroyed with artillery. 20 Germans dead, no American casualties." Ambrose set the report down. His jaw was tight. "Sergeant, I'm not questioning your results. I'm questioning your methods. What you're describing requires getting so close to enemy positions that one mistake means capture or death. We can't afford to lose scouts." "We're losing entire squads," Tommy said. "Hayes is dead. Anderson is dead. Doherty, Palmieri, Hutchins, all dead because spotters call in fire we can't stop. And if you get killed trying this shadow link technique, we lose our best scout and gain nothing. Then I won't get killed." Ambrose stood up. "I'm making this clear, Sergeant. You are forbidden from attempting this technique. That's a direct order. You will continue standard reconnaissance patrols, and you will not under any circumstances. Attempt to close within 100 yards of enemy positions. Understood? Tommy understood. He also understood that men would keep dying. 2 days later, before dawn on March 14th, Tommy loaded his pack and slipped out of camp. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He didn't file a patrol report. He just walked into no man's land with a trench knife, 2 canteens, and a map marked with 5 spotter positions that had been particularly deadly. The first position was in a collapsed barn, 300 yards northwest of the American lines. Tommy had been observing it for a week. 2 spotters worked in rotation, one watching the Allied positions through binoculars while the other monitored radio equipment. They had a schedule. Every 14 minutes, the watcher would hand off the binoculars and they'd swap roles. During the handoff, there was a gap, 6 seconds, when both men were focused on the equipment exchange, neither watching their sectors. Tommy crawled through a drainage ditch filled with 3 inches of water that smelled like sewage and death. The sun rose behind him, casting his shadow forward, but he'd timed his approach for when the spotters would be looking west into the glare. He moved during their radio checks when static crackled and one spotter would adjust frequencies while the other wrote in a logbook. It took him 90 minutes to cover 200 yards. At 7:53 a.m., he was 20 feet from the barn's collapsed wall. He could hear their conversation. One of them was complaining about coffee. The other was talking about a girl in Munich. Tommy waited. At 8:07 a.m., the radio crackled with an incoming transmission. Both spotters turned to the equipment. Tommy moved. He covered the 20 feet in 4 seconds, coming through the gap in the wall low and fast. The first spotter turned his head at the last moment. His mouth opened to shout. Tommy's knife caught him under the jaw, angled upward, severing the scream before it could form. The second spotter reached for his rifle. Tommy yanked the knife free and drove it into the man's throat. Both were dead in 8 seconds. No shots fired, no radio transmission, just silence. Tommy dragged both bodies into the barn's cellar and covered them with debris. He took their radio equipment and smashed it. Then he marked the position on his map and moved to the next target. Position 2 was a German observation post in a grove of olive trees 600 yards east. 3 spotters here, more sophisticated equipment. Tommy spent 2 hours observing their pattern from a distance. They operated in overlapping sectors, one watching north, one watching south, one coordinating with artillery batteries. Every 20 minutes, they rotated positions. Tommy waited until the rotation. That was when their attention collapsed inward, when they were focused on each other instead of the landscape. He moved during the handoff, using the olive trees as cover, advancing in 5-yard sprints timed to the wind rustling through branches. Sound masking. Another trick from the mines, where you moved when the timber creaked, so the sound of your boots got lost in the general noise. At 11:34 a.m., he was in the grove. The spotters were 10 feet away, arguing about artillery coordinates for a target they'd identified. One of them gestured at a map. The others leaned in to look. Tommy came from behind. The trench knife was designed for close work, for killing without noise. He'd learned the technique from an instructor at Benning who'd fought in the trenches during the First World War. You didn't stab, you cut. Throat first, then arteries. Fast and surgical. All 3 spotters died before any of them could reach their weapons. Tommy smashed their radio and moved on. Position 3 was the most exposed. A two-man team in a ruined pillbox on Hill 73, the same position where Hayes had died. This one was harder. The pillbox had clear sight lines in all directions. No drainage ditches, no olive groves, just 400 yards of open ground with scattered rubble for cover. Tommy studied it from a crater 200 yards out. The spotters were visible through the pillbox's observation slit, two silhouettes against the darkness inside. They swept binoculars across the Allied lines every 30 seconds. Methodical, disciplined, no obvious gaps in their pattern. But they had to eat. Tommy waited at 1:47 p.m. One of the spotters set down his binoculars and unwrapped something, bread probably, or canned meat. The second spotter continued scanning, but now he was doing the work of two men. His sweeps became faster, less thorough, trying to cover twice the area in the same time. Tommy moved during those faster sweeps, when the spotter's eyes were racing across sectors instead of studying them. He crawled, elbows and knees, face in the dirt, using rubble piles as anchor points. The sun was high and hot. Sweat ran into his eyes. His shoulders burned. At 2:31 p.m., he reached the pillbox's blind spot, a collapsed section of wall on the eastern side. He could hear them talking inside. One was complaining about the heat. The other was saying something about a girlfriend back in Hamburg. Tommy circled to the entrance, moving along the wall so slowly that it took him 4 minutes to cover 12 feet. At the entrance, he paused, listened. One spotter was chewing. The other was adjusting radio dials. He went in fast. The first spotter turned, eyes wide, hand reaching for a Luger on the table. Tommy's knife took him in the chest. The second spotter dropped his food and grabbed for his rifle. Tommy yanked the knife free and threw it. The blade tumbled once and buried itself in the spotter's throat. He collapsed, gurgling, hands clawing at the handle. Tommy retrieved the knife. Both spotters bled out in silence. He destroyed the radio and marked the map. 2 positions left. Position 4 was a spotter team in a burned-out farmhouse 800 yards south. Position 5 was on the edge of a tree line, overlooking the main supply route into Anzio. Both were visible from each other, which meant Tommy couldn't approach during daylight. If one team saw movement near the other position, they'd radio a warning, and German infantry would swarm the area. He waited for dark. At 6:22 p.m., the sun dropped behind the Alban Hills. Tommy moved toward the farmhouse, using the same shadow-linking technique, but adapted for twilight. He tracked where the spotters directed their attention by watching the glow of their cigarettes. When the ember brightened, they were inhaling, eyes closed for a fraction of a second. When it dimmed, they were scanning. He moved during the brightening, during those micro-gaps, when their night vision was compromised by the cigarette's glow. At 8:04 p.m., he was inside the farmhouse. 2 spotters, both tired, both careless. One was asleep in a corner. The other was monitoring radio traffic with his back to the door. Tommy killed the sleeping one first, then the radio operator. Both died without waking up properly. He didn't destroy this radio. Instead, he used it, keyed the microphone, and transmitted random static for 30 seconds, then went silent. At the tree-line position, the 5th spotter team would be listening, trying to figure out why their sister position had just transmitted nonsense. Tommy left the farmhouse and moved toward the tree line. He could see the spotters now, 2 silhouettes backlit by a small lamp inside their position. They were arguing, voices rising. One was saying they should check on the farmhouse. The other was saying it was probably just radio malfunction. Neither of them was watching their sectors. Tommy covered the 400 yards in 18 minutes, moving through darkness that felt like home. At 8:47 p.m., he reached their position, a camouflage tent tucked into the trees. The spotters were still arguing. One had a map spread out. The other was fiddling with radio equipment. Tommy came through the tent flap like a shadow. They looked up, saw him. One reached for a rifle. Too slow. Tommy's knife opened his throat. The second spotter lunged for the tent entrance. Tommy caught him from behind, one hand over the man's mouth, the other driving the knife between his ribs. The spotter convulsed and went still. 5 positions, 12 spotters, 0 shots fired. Tommy dragged the bodies into the underbrush and smashed the final radio. Then he sat down on the ground, back against a tree, and let the exhaustion hit him. His hands were shaking. His uniform was soaked with sweat and blood. His shoulders felt like they were made of broken glass. He'd done it. The walk back to American lines took 3 hours. He moved slowly, too tired to be careful, following instinct more than planning. At 11:53 p.m., he stumbled into the perimeter wire and got challenged by a sentry who nearly shot him before recognizing his face. Lieutenant Ambrose was waiting in his tent. "Where the hell have you been, Sergeant?" Tommy set down his pack. His knife was still sheathed, still bloody. "Patrol." "Patrol where? You didn't file a route plan." "German positions, northwest sector." Ambrose stared at him, at the blood on his uniform, at the exhaustion in his face. "What did you do?" "What you ordered me not to do." The lieutenant's jaw tightened. "Explain." Tommy pulled out his map and laid it on the table. 5 positions marked in red. 12 spotters, 5 radio stations, all eliminated. No shots fired, no Allied casualties. Ambrose looked at the map, looked at Tommy. "You used the Shadowlink technique." "Yes, sir." "After I explicitly ordered you not to." "Yes, sir." "Do you understand what you've done? This is insubordination. This is a court-martial offense." Tommy met his eyes. "Hayes is still dead. So is Anderson, Doherty, Palmieri, Hutchins. So are the 42 men from Baker Company. I couldn't bring them back, but I could stop more from dying the same way." Ambrose opened his mouth, closed it. He looked at the map again, at the 5 marked positions, at the tactical implications. Without those spotters, German artillery would be firing blind. Without accurate coordinates, their shells would be wasted ammunition instead of precision instruments of slaughter. "You're confined to camp pending investigation," Ambrose finally said. "I'm reporting this up the chain. What happens next isn't my decision." Tommy nodded. He expected prison. He expected dishonorable discharge. He expected to spend the rest of the war breaking rocks in a military stockade. What he didn't expect was what happened the next morning. At 6:15 a.m. on March 15th, German artillery opened up on the Anzio beachhead with their usual dawn barrage. But something was wrong. The shells fell randomly, scattered across sectors without coordination. No precision, no bracketing, no walking fire that adjusted onto targets. Just blind firing based on pre-sighted coordinates that didn't account for Allied movements during the night. A company moved up to probe Hill 73. No artillery response. They reached the pillbox without taking fire. Found Tommy's work inside. 2 dead spotters, a destroyed radio, and silence. By noon, word spread through the division. Someone had eliminated 5 spotter positions in a single day. Officers didn't know who. enlisted men started making guesses. By evening, someone had figured it out, and the story spread through the ranks like wildfire. Tommy Reeves, the scout from Kentucky, the crazy bastard who'd done it alone. At 7:30 p.m., Tommy was escorted to division headquarters. He expected court-martial proceedings. Instead, he found himself standing in front of Colonel John Sherman, division intelligence officer, who was studying Tommy's map with an expression somewhere between fury and fascination. "Sergeant Reeves," Sherman said, "you've created a significant problem." "Yes, sir." "Lieutenant Ambrose wants you court-martialed for insubordination. He's not wrong. You violated a direct order." "Yes, sir." "However," Sherman set down the map, "in the 24 hours since you eliminated those spotter positions, German artillery effectiveness has dropped by 63%. 63%, Sergeant. Do you understand what that means?" Tommy said nothing. "It means you've saved more lives in one day than most soldiers save in an entire war." Sherman leaned back in his chair. "It also means we need to figure out what the hell to do with you. We can't court-martial you. Morale would collapse if word got out we were punishing the man who just crippled German artillery. But we also can't reward you for flagrant insubordination. So we're going to do something else." "Sir?" "You're going to teach your technique. Not to scouts, to a specialized unit we're putting together. Men who can do what you did. Get close, eliminate spotters, destroy radio equipment, disappear. We're calling it deep reconnaissance. You'll train them, lead them, and if they're as effective as you've been, we'll expand the program across the entire Fifth Army." Tommy blinked. "I'm not being court-martialed?" "Oh, you're absolutely being court-martialed," Sherman said. "But the sentence is suspended pending your service with the new unit. Consider it probation with extreme prejudice. You teach soldiers your shadow link technique, you lead missions, and you don't get shot. Those are the terms. Acceptable?" Tommy nodded. "Yes, sir." "Good. Report to Captain Williams tomorrow at 600. He'll brief you on the unit composition. Dismissed." Tommy left headquarters in a daze. He'd expected prison. Instead, he'd been given a command. The next 6 weeks were brutal. Captain Williams, a former OSS officer who'd done similar work in North Africa, assembled a team of 12 men, scouts, snipers, and one former burglar from Brooklyn, who'd been given the choice between the army and prison. Tommy taught them everything. How to read enemy attention patterns, how to move in blind spots, how to time advances with environmental noise, how to kill silently and disappear. Most importantly, he taught them patience. Shadow linking isn't about speed, he told them during their first training session. It's about timing. You don't rush. You watch. You learn the pattern. Then you move when the pattern creates a gap. If you force it, you die. If you wait for it, you survive. They trained at night on mock German positions, staffed by division personnel. Tommy would position observers with binoculars and radios, then send his trainees to eliminate them without being detected. The first week, everyone got caught. The second week, half got caught. By the fourth week, they were succeeding 80% of the time. On April 23rd, they ran their first operational mission. A German spotter network had been established in the ruins of Cisterna, coordinating artillery fire that was stalling the Allied breakout from Anzio. 4 positions, 8 spotters, sophisticated radio equipment. Division wanted them eliminated before the main offensive kicked off. Tommy took his team in at midnight. They split into 4 pairs, each targeting one position. Tommy took the most exposed site, a bell tower overlooking the main road. His partner was the burglar from Brooklyn, a thin kid named Marcus Tolliver, who could pick locks in complete darkness and moved like a ghost. They reached the tower at 2:14 a.m. 2 spotters inside, both awake, both scanning sectors with night vision binoculars. Tommy and Tolliver waited, watching the pattern. Every 6 minutes, one spotter would descend from the upper level to check their supply cache on the ground floor. 30 seconds alone. That was the gap. At 2:38 a.m., the first spotter descended. Tommy went up, found the second spotter focused on his binoculars, watching the Allied lines. Tommy's knife opened his throat before he could turn around. Tolliver, meanwhile, had taken the first spotter on the ground floor. Both kills were silent. Both radios were destroyed. By 4:47 a.m., all 4 positions were eliminated. 0 shots fired, 0 American casualties, 8 German spotters dead. The Allied offensive launched at dawn. German artillery fired blind. The breakout succeeded. Word spread fast. Division Command requested more teams. By May, Tommy was training 30 men. By June, the program had expanded to every division in 5th Army. They called them Deep Reconnaissance Sections, but everyone knew the real name: Shadow Link Teams. German forces began noticing something disturbing. Their spotter networks were collapsing. Positions that should have been secure were being eliminated overnight. Bodies were found with throats cut, radios destroyed, no evidence of how the attackers had gotten close. German intelligence intercepted Allied communications, mentioning shadow tactics and pattern infiltration. But the reports were fragmentary and confusing. On July the 8th, a German after-action report filed by a lieutenant named Klaus Werner described an encounter near Florence. Werner had been part of a quick reaction force responding to a missing spotter team. They found the position intact but abandoned. The radio was destroyed, blood on the floor. No bodies. The spotters had been dragged away and hidden. Werner's report included a chilling detail. No signs of combat, no shell casings, no bullet impacts. Whoever eliminated our observers did so with knives, in darkness, without triggering any alarm. Recommend immediate review of security protocols. Current defensive measures are ineffective against this form of infiltration. The report was filed and ignored. German doctrine hadn't changed since the Western Front in 1918. Defensive positions were built to stop frontal assaults, not prevent infiltration by individual soldiers. By August, German spotter casualties in Italy had reached crisis levels. Artillery effectiveness continued to decline. Back in Allied territory, Tommy's team had become legendary. Soldiers would see them moving through camps at night, quiet men with knives and blackened faces who didn't talk much and didn't stay long. They'd disappear for days, then return with reports of eliminated positions and destroyed equipment. Casualty rates in their operational sectors dropped by an average of 41%, but success brought scrutiny. On September 3rd, Tommy was summoned to Corps headquarters. A brigadier general named Whitfield, fresh from the States with a West Point education and no combat experience, had read the reports on Shadow Link teams and decided they violated the rules of warfare. "These tactics are assassination," Whitfield said, "not combat." Tommy stood at attention in front of the general's desk. Captain Williams was there too, looking uncomfortable. "With respect, sir," Williams said, "these tactics have saved hundreds of lives." By encouraging soldiers to murder enemy personnel in their sleep, Whitfield replied. That's not soldiering. That's butchery. Tommy spoke quietly. German spotters direct artillery fire that kills our men by the dozen. They do it from positions we can't reach with conventional tactics. Shadow linking gets us close enough to stop them. If that's butchery, then I'm a butcher. But Hayes, Anderson, Doherty, they're still dead because we followed conventional tactics. Whitfield's face reddened. I don't need a lecture on tactics from a sergeant. Then don't lecture me on morality, Tommy shot back. Every man I've killed was killing us first. That's not murder. That's war. The room went silent. Williams closed his eyes. Tommy knew he'd just ended his career. But Whitfield surprised him. The general leaned back in his chair and studied Tommy for a long moment. You're right, he finally said. And I hate that you're right. War is ugly. Sometimes the ugliest tactics are the most effective. I'm not shutting down your program, Sergeant, but I want clear rules of engagement. Shadow Link teams target spotters, radio operators, and forward observers only. No general infantry. No rear echelon personnel. You kill the men who are directing fire at our troops, and nobody else. Understood? Yes, sir. Good. Because if this program starts targeting German cooks and supply clerks, I will shut it down and court-martial everyone involved. These are precision tactics, not a license for indiscriminate killing. Maintain that distinction. Tommy maintained it. By the time the Italian campaign ended in May 1945, Shadow Link teams had eliminated over 400 German spotters, destroyed countless radio stations, and reduced enemy artillery effectiveness by an estimated 58% across all operational sectors. Conservative estimates credited the program with saving between 800 and 1,200 Allied lives. Tommy Reeves received no medal, no commendation, no official recognition. His name appeared in classified after-action reports that remained sealed for 50 years. On May 10, 1945, 2 days after Germany surrendered, Tommy was discharged from the Army with the rank of Staff Sergeant. He took a bus back to Kentucky and returned to Harlan County like nothing had happened. He got a job working construction, then mining again, because that was what men did in Harlan County. He married a woman named Sarah, who worked at the diner on Main Street. They had 3 children. He never talked about the war. Not to Sarah, not to his kids, not to anyone. Once a year, on March 14th, Tommy would get a phone call. Marcus Tolliver, the burglar from Brooklyn, who'd become one of the best Shadow Link operators in Italy. They'd talk for 10 minutes. Never about the war directly, just about whether they were still alive, still okay, still managing. You still having the dreams? Tolliver asked one year. Sometimes, Tommy said. Me too. They'd hang up and go back to their lives. Tommy died on January 4th, 1987, in a hospital in Lexington. He was 62. Heart attack. His obituary in the Harlan Daily Enterprise was 4 paragraphs long. One paragraph mentioned his military service. Mr. Reeves served with distinction in the United States Army during World War II, stationed in Italy with the 3rd Infantry Division. No mention of Shadow Link. No mention of 12 spotters eliminated in one day. No mention of the 400 more eliminated by the teams he trained. His funeral was attended by 70 people. Marcus Tolliver flew in from New York. Captain Williams, retired and gray-haired, came from Virginia. A dozen other men Tommy had trained showed up without being asked. They stood in the back during the service and didn't say much. After the burial, Williams approached Sarah. "Your husband saved my life," he said. "Probably saved it a dozen times. Just wanted you to know that." Sarah nodded. "He never talked about it. He wouldn't have. That was Tommy. Did the work, came home, moved on." Years later, in 2003, a military historian named David Richardson was researching Italian campaign tactics when he found a reference to specialized reconnaissance sections in a declassified Fifth Army report. The details were sparse, but intriguing. Richardson spent 4 years tracking down veterans, reading after-action reports, and piecing together the story of Shadow Link teams. His book, published in 2007, was titled Silent Hunters: Deep Reconnaissance in the Italian Campaign. It dedicated an entire chapter to Tommy Reeves and calculated that Shadow Link tactics had reduced Allied casualties in Italy by approximately 11% across the 18-month period they were operational. 11% doesn't sound like much, but in a campaign where 15,000 Americans died, 11% means over 1,600 soldiers who came home instead of dying on Italian hillsides. That's Tommy Reeves' legacy. Not a medal, not a monument. Just 1,600 men who got to see their families again because a coal miner from Kentucky learned how to move in shadows and taught others to do the same. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through committees examining doctrine and writing new field manuals. Not through generals in headquarters planning elegant strategies. Through sergeants who watch their friends die and decide they won't watch anymore. Through men who break rules because the rules are killing people. Through techniques developed in darkness and taught in whispers, because official channels move too slow and men are dying too fast. Shadow linking violated doctrine. It violated tactical theory. It violated the career officer's sense of how warfare should be conducted. Cleanly, from a distance, with proper authorization. But it worked. And in war, working matters more than anything else. Tommy Reeves understood that. So he did what needed doing, accepted the consequences, and went home when it was over. No fanfare, no glory. Just the quiet knowledge that he'd done something that mattered. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.